Thank you guys. Super excited to have you here at Boston Comics in Color, another in-person edition. Today you're here for the Sixth Element panel, and I'm just going to read some quick bios for all of our amazing panelists today. We are going to have room for questions from the audience too, and if you happen to come up with them before we reach the end, just raise your hand because I want this to be like very interactive since we are in person, and that's one of the best parts of being in person. All right, starting to my right. We're going to go with Barrington Edwards. Is an award-winning teacher, artist, and community activist from Boston. He is a publisher of Comics and Graphic Media and is also the co-founder of Comics in Color. He attended Massachusetts College of Art and earned a BFA in Communications Design and an MSc in Art Education. And he also taught art at the Boston Arts Academy for 19 years, although currently he teaches art education at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Thank you for being with us today. Rob Stoll is an illustrator, curator, designer, and creator of comic books. In addition to working through his own studio, Ink on Paper, he has worked over 2 decades for pretty much every major publisher, including Marvel and DC, and his projects have included Spider-Man's Adventures, Iron Man, X-Force, Nightwing, and more. He holds a BFA from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and is also featured in the book The History of American Graffiti. Did I miss anything?
A couple other books.
Oh my gosh.
It's okay.
Mike and Mark, just going to introduce together.
All right.
Because these...
We're born that way.
Right. Because these twin brothers make up the 2-man art team known as the Mad Twins. They've worked in animation, comic books, toy design, fashion, and live action film. And their dynamic style has earned them a piece on ABC's Blackish in collaboration with The Roots. And they've also done animated TV shows running from Boondocks to How to Train Your Dragon, Riders of Berg. The creator-owned intellectual property, Blackheads, which you should all pick up, has been published as a graphic novel in Europe, South America, and in North America by Simon & Schuster. So excited to have you guys with us today. And I am just your humble random moderator, Kristen, who also serves on the Comics and Color Committee, and I'm a media and culture reviewer for the website Forces of Geek here in New England. So, I think it's pretty easy in general for people to connect hip-hop and graffiti, but when we connect it back to comics, there's like a whole nother chapter in there. So I'd love to hear from each of you guys, kind of in your own origin story style, like where did comics come into play in your history with hip hop and graffiti?
Are we going linear?
We can go linear.
Are we
all right.
in this mic or not?
No, y'all just talking and
Okay.
expressing outwardly to this
All right.
crowd.
Outward.
It's on though.
I mean, it's on, yes.
Okay, I don't want
It's like,
to interfere
it's on
with
for
it.
the video.
All right. So I grew up right here, and not actually very far from here at all, in Roxbury. One side of my street was Roxbury, another was Dorchester, as things are in Boston, very confusing. And comics and graffiti were like my left hand and my right hand. In one hand I had a comic book, in the other I had a black book, which we call the Bible. And I learned as a youth, just in whatever art schools, art classes I had, but more I learned from my peers in those spaces that were both doing comics and doing graffiti, and comics were always influencing we look like characters and find ways to be inventive and incorporate them into graffiti, and it just, those two things always influenced me growing up. And the struggle between comics and graffiti for me was so much so that I never really, I'm better at comics than graph, but I always think of graph in terms of storytelling, and probably less on the letters and can control. But for me, that marriage is always inseparable, to the point that now a lot of the grant-funded work that I'm doing is about exploring the intersections between the graph community and the comics community, and how they can work out on overlaps and like make it explicit so people see it and not just understand it in their bones.
Beautiful. I have extra questions on that later.
Ooh.
Continue.
So we'll just go down the line.
Sure, you go down.
Well,
If they feel something first, they should say it. But otherwise,
do you feel something?
we can go straight down.
I'm looking forward to hear what you guys
Okay.
say.
Well, there's a lot of similarities and parallels to what Barrington said. I think I kind of focused on the foundational elements from a hip hop standpoint and a cultural.
I can barely hear.
Yeah.
So much noise back here, I can barely hear the song.
Well, let me.
He can
think
talk
the-
into the
I think the mic's
microphone,
for
but
the
it's not
camera.
gonna.
The mic's for the
stay there.
video.
You just need to.
I'll try to enunciate. I know. I was just saying foundational elements for me. In terms of hip hop from a cultural standpoint, because I was completely fixated on hip hop culture and completely fascinated me. I had relatives that lived in New York. I visited New York often. I would take the elevated lines. My older sister lived in Queens, and I remember the rooftop graffitis, on the graffiti on the rooftops. Those were like art galleries to me. And I'm being just a little kid, not really having a formal introduction to the culture, but getting exposed to individual snippets and elements of it beforehand. That's how young I was, 13, 14 years of age. And then later having the more formal introduction to it where I put it all together. I said, okay, that's what they were doing. That's what this meant. It's part of a whole. I was experiencing it in individual increments. The graffiti coming from a visual arts background captivated me first, and I made instant connections with that. So like Barrington, I grew up here, that being an extension of my way that I wanted to express myself, because it is all storytelling. And there's that sort of intrinsic connection there, because every aspect, in my opinion, of hip hop culture is storytelling. Every aspect of animation, if you're what you're doing, storyboarding for movies, boards for commercials, advertising work, you're all conveying and telling a story. So that was the thing that hooked me. Comics was just like a natural progression for me. I was a comic nerd. I grew up reading comics. So the graffiti and comic book and hip hop culture as the elements connecting each other just made sense. And it was always that underground marriage that existed between the two. And you can see it in the earliest examples of the subway art on trains that New York City writers were doing, and they were kids at the time. Dondi with the inspiration with Cheech Wizard and Junk Waffle and Fawn Bodie. So the list goes on and on and on. But that was my introduction to it and how I got all consumed and captivated with it. And then it just continued to take form from there.
Yeah. I have a lot of similarities, I feel like, between what these two brothers are saying, you know what I mean? We grew up right over the bridge in Cambridge, and our introduction to hip hop and comics, I'm trying to think which was first, but they were kind of simultaneous, but we didn't really make the connections to the two, right? I think it was more like the comics, we were into the visuals. We were just always into visuals. We would create our own characters, and we would have we would get grounded, right? And there was no TV in our room or no nothing. So we would draw people that we saw outside and make all these little worlds. But then when when cable and TV started to be TV, I'm mad old, but when cable became a thing and we started to see some of the hip hop that was coming out of New York, and we had cousins, we had people that would come from New York and give us the music and stuff. But when we started to see some of the visuals in motion, some of the old school movies like Wild Style, and you saw the graffiti culture, I instantly gravitated to the words, right? Just the idea of making words their own story, you know what I mean? And starting to break it down in a way that later on translated. When me and my brother worked together, we would do flyers, for example, back in the day when they were physical things, and I would do all the letters and he would do all the characters. You know what I mean? But it was still coming from a hip hop perspective. You want to add on? I don't want to take the whole thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, you guys pretty much covered it. I mean, we're all kind of cut from the same cloth, right?
hip hop is an instrumental factor in kind of curating our visual, like what we kind of gravitate to, right? So the music was really influencing just the cool stuff, you know, making. What me and Mike tried to do was really just try to literally take what we're hearing and try to visualize that, right? And so just the energy, being visual people, right? Artists are visual. That's the first thing. That's how we communicate. That's why we're not the greatest speakers, right? We're always just focusing on the visual and the art, right? But the music is what fueled it. So not seeing so many things that kind of represented hip hop it took us a while to see that loophole, right? That there wasn't as many things that represented hip hop visually, right? Especially in comic books. Especially in comic books. Graffiti is that exact example of the visual representing the energy of hip hop, right? But in comics, it took a long time for that to catch on, right? But there's tons of us guys who just is fueled by the music and just, you know, and there's ton of us black nerds, hip hop nerds, but it's only up until like the late 90s when that really started to come to the foreground. But in the comics, right? Right, in the comics, right? So for example, like Pharrell was kind of the first guy, and I might be dating myself, but he was the first guy who really made the black nerd cool and kind of brought it to the forefront. So then you had Kanye and all those guys. But before then, when we was young, we really couldn't say that we was into comic books. At least I know we couldn't. We kind of that was kind of like a secret thing that we kept to ourselves, you know. But then once that became popular, and then guys like us grow up and go into the comic book industry and the animation industry, now we can take our influences and put that into, you know, the comic books where the consumer goes and buys that, and then like our influences start to bleed out into the masses. So I know it took us all around the world, but that, you know, we pretty much have a similar origin story, but it's just a blessing for us to take that origin story and now give it out to the world, you know.
I knew that you were.
Could I add something to that?
Yes, of course.
100%.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to add is
But I'm gonna ask you to speak up every single time.
prior to that time, and I think you got the errors spot on, where it was a question of identity and not being able to see in like the standard fare, which is, let's just be honest, Marvel and DC Comics. It's like they set the precedent. And then even us as individual creators, whether it's an IP, an independent property, or your own thing, you take inspiration by what preceded whatever you're working on and whatever you're about to embark on. So the identity and seeing what you were into wasn't being reflected in the standard fare. So we didn't know. We had no way of gauging or knowing that we were individual all by ourselves in our own little dark corners, just geeking out on the stuff that we liked, until we started meeting our contemporaries in the field, and they're like, well, yeah, I love that stuff too. You know, and then because it was a different time when I first broke into the industry, and the access to just information is so much different now. It's readily available. There's almost no excuse if this is, you know, an area that you want to enter in on. So I thought that was important to state, where your colleagues and your professionals, we all shared the same kind of, that shared vision, but we didn't know that we were all alone until we started to congregate and then build our own platform to tell our own stories.
And the more I love being around artists, like particularly black artists, right? Because a lot of us share the same type of trajectory. And I know for me and Mike, well, Mike and I, excuse Mike.
It's good, bro. It's good.
But no, we didn't used to draw black characters as kids. Yeah. Because, like you said, we were just, at first, we were just drawing what we saw, right? And what came before us, the Marvel and DC's, like I remember when Black Panther wasn't cool. It was like, Black Panther, nah, like he was black. And he was always covered, right? So I want to just add on to what you're saying, like at a certain age, we didn't have we didn't have the agency to be like, I can draw my experience, because what we thought was established already was what we had to follow. We thought that was the model. So if we wanted to break into the industry, we should draw what the industry provides. And everything at that time, because there was a lack of information, right? There was just, everything was analog, right? There was no internet. We didn't have that access. Everything reflected one narrative of the American experience, and it wasn't us, right? And I'm talking about, we come from immigrant parents. My parents they're dark skinned and they speak Spanish. So that really messed my head up too, because I'm like, I remember somebody told me that you're not black because your parents speak Spanish. And being young, I believed it. And I was like, wait a minute. What's going on? But that made me dive deeper into my roots and to find out the diaspora and like the beauty of how Africans were spread across the continent, right? And being that like America only had about 12% of the Africans that were taken from Africa into the world, right? So we're talking about like Brazil and all that, like the Afro-Latino stuff, right? And so that trajectory took us, just finding that out and someone saying that to me and me having to do the knowledge now, it kind of converged into like wanting to tell those stories in the comic books, because first the comic books weren't reflecting what our experience was. Then I had like identity things that I had to figure out because somebody gave me a screwball that I believed, you know what I mean? And I think it's really important for us to kind of bring those stories to the forefront when there is now, you know, the ease of access to information, right? So that the young kids can, no matter what their background, can say, you know, my voice matters. This is my experience. It's unique, and it's relevant to whatever you know, medium that I want to put it through. So.
You know, who do you think out there is like really doing that for you right now? I'm going to be honest, I will also date myself since everyone else has shared things. Like when I was younger, yes, Black Panther wasn't that cool, but the moment that Static Shock came out, like it was, I felt very seen. Me and my brother would be like right there in front of that television. This was the music we were listening to. This was the hair. This was the multiple types of hairstyles that we had or wanted to emulate. And again, it was just out of the blue. Like I had never read that comic, but suddenly being able to see it was everything to me. But for what's happening right now, like what are you guys seeing that's going to give you like hope that like some kid's going to see that and be like, I see myself there?
I mean,
you can literally say Blockheads. I know you want to.
No. My own
I'll
stuff.
say
Say your own
Blockheads.
IP, yeah.
Blockheads, I say.
Well, thank you guys for too kind.
Oh, stop.
The Spider-Verse shit is just my language. I'm sorry. The Spider-Verse stuff is amazing.
Bananas.
Listen, they crushed it, you know, and it's like, and you see how successful, because before Hollywood ran with the narrative that you know, the black people leads can't they can't sell, right? Like they don't make money, right? Like a blackface as a hero, as a main superhero doesn't make money. Well, Black Panther broke that mold, and then Spider-Verse just took that to another level, because animation has its own like stereotype that it wouldn't work. But you know, Miles Morales like did the thing, and then in Encanto, and I didn't see it, I know, but he's been raving about it. But
I have a 3-year-old.
There's stuff like that. There's stuff like that that's really just starting to open the doors for more diverse stories, and that, you know, that helps everybody, man. But I would encourage you guys to pick up Blockheads. It's kind of
I might be in the minority, but I thought Black Panther was cool from the gate. I'm sorry. and I think it's a generational thing because
It might be.
and I think this is real because just of the lack of. You know, you had Black Panther, you had Storm, and then you had a whole lot of stereotypical stuff that was of the time, I'll say, because it was coming from white writers, let's just be clear, and it was in the 70s and the late 60s. So we were, as a country and a community within that country, isolated in a lot of aspects, trying to find our way in other areas of entertainment and media. So when you have so few, to me, the most positive of that bunch, even though I gravitated, not necessarily identified with, but I gravitated toward all of them, even Luke Cage, even Black Lightning. And I say even because at least Black Panther, he was royalty. He was a king. So to me, I could identify with that based on the seeds that my mother and father planted, within me. So I'm saying, yeah, this is something that can inspire me. This is something that I can gain inspiration from. And just as a kid, well before trying to carve out a career path for myself. So and then Storm was soon to follow. So I think, looking at it from that perspective, I thought he was incredibly cool. And then you started to see a transition in content and subject matter, especially from the top two, where a lot of those stories were being pursued and lobbied after by Black creators. But we had to establish our presence before that time. You know what I mean? So
No, that's a good point. And looking back at it as a kid, that I don't know what it is. I don't know why that I didn't pick up on. I just never got into him. So if I would have gave him a chance, I would have been like, oh, this is dope. But I didn't even know he was a king until later on. But Storm was the one who I really was like, now this is the direction that I like. Like I think, because she was just so powerful, and they could have done more with her. But I just thought like the power of her, that she's controlling nature, and she just looked cool. Like
I think,
that was,
I think I wanted to like Storm for me too, because in my mind I always see the image of. I'm gonna geek out a little bit here, but I don't know what issue it is. But when Storm fought Cyclops to lead the X-Men, and she 201, my man.
who said that?
I get along.
In the back. And she ripped off his visor. She didn't use her powers. You know what I mean? And she had the punk rock look, because punk rock and hip hop share the same spirit, right? It's all rebellion. To me, I was like, that is what I want to do. At the time, I didn't really realize it, that like that's why I gravitated towards her. Because later on, you had books like Brother Man, which is what really kind of put us into like the space where it was like super hip hop, right? Like undeniably, but it didn't have to put that in the forefront. It didn't have to say this is hip hop. Because it was
hip-hop.
right. It was just
The
the style.
composition, the animation was all hip hop.
Yeah.
And that when you asked the question, I went straight to Dun You's work. I'm like, whoa, that Brother Man was it. But before Brother Man, and I'm sorry if it seems like I'm just fanboying for people who are in the room now. But I told him before at the gate, Larry Stroman's Tribe, like that book.
If you didn't say it, I was going
That
to.
book, because I was looking honestly like at Black Panther. I was like, this is a nice try. I appreciate the effort, but it still felt like they were going off the tropes, and I just wasn't sure where they were going with it, and I saw too much room for them to go left with Black Panther as a design. And Storm, I love Storm. I love all those Black characters, and when you talked about like in the panel that just left, there was a guy that I met him at the door. You saw me chatting to him, somebody I knew from high school. And we both threw hands and we collected comics together. And we were both like so nerdy and so hood and so walking around here trying not to get jumped, but we would still communicate through comics. And for me, the energy of like seeing like, oh, I got something for you. I have something you haven't seen. Like books like Tribe. The design and books like Brother Man, like that. Not that it didn't have to be performative. It didn't have to do stereotypes, but the look And that to me, if we connect it back to graph, like that to me, that's at some point in time, like the pre-teacher teacher in me kicked in. I'm like, this is the curriculum, the line, shape, form, composition, movement. This is the stuff that I could see on trains, like when I'm going through the Source magazine and seeing, spreads by pose, or when I see all I see is Crime in the City going through, like, that's sequential animation for me. And my brain was still, for 30 years, trying to put it together and figure out how we can make that tacit connection between hip hop, graffiti specifically, because I'm really passionate about the fact that graffiti is the most unadulterated form of hip hop. Like, people haven't found a way to really commercialize graffiti, and you can't. When you say hip hop is like punk rock, graffiti is the punk rock of the punk rock, and it's like, I love that. And there are aspects to the culture, the communal culture of hip hop that are still represented, like in graffiti and in the underground comics, like Blockheads, like Brother Man, and the stuff that I saw in Tribe. I'm like, this is it. This is, if you're asking, for me, that's what lit me on fire. And I think as I teach my students, and there's none in here right now, but keep doing what you love doing, and the mainstream will always find out who the cool kids are. The mainstream will always come and find out what the underground is doing, and they'll try to co-opt it, but you can just reinvent and just keep pushing, because there's a limit to how much the mainstream will co-opt you, because they want to, stay respectable. But that's why I'm really a fan of people who kind of do their own thing. And Larry was talking earlier about, like, they didn't think this book was going to sell, so we just did our own thing, right? And I think that subversiveness, that's at the core of hip hop. Can you hear? Can you guys hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Karen, you got me? All right.
When can we start asking questions?
That was right about to say. I was about to say,
All
for
right.
time, I'd like to stop my questions for a moment. Is there a person? I have one out here.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Introduce yourself.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
They're gonna introduce you.
I'm just a guy that used to...
No, he's not.
I will formally introduce
Thank
my
you.
big bro, Larry Stroman, luminary in the comic book industry, highest selling African American comic book in history, Tribe. That's that guy right there.
And where's he from? Where's he from?
He's from Boston.
I tried.
Since you're on the subject, most of the time when people talk about things that have inspired them or what they grew up into, whatever, it's usually just one thing going in one direction. But what this is showing is that the inspiration comes from all different places.
Right.
And what I had found out for myself is that the inspiration that you get is not always an immediate thing. Sometimes we start off hating something, you end up like, I hated graffiti. I despised it. But here's the reason why I despised it. When I first moved to New York, which was around between 1979 and 1980, graffiti dominated the whole place.
Right.
When you were in Harlem, when you were in Queens, Brooklyn, you couldn't even get on the train and look out the window. Because there was so much graffiti on top of graffiti, on top of graffiti, on top of graffiti, to the point where you couldn't read any of it. You didn't know who none of these people were. These mysterious people, like, where does all the spray paint come from? And when they couldn't use the spray paint, they used magic markers. And they started wiping
Sandpaper.
that stuff off. They were taking stuff and carving into the plastic windows. This graffiti stuff. So it was just everywhere. It was just so overwhelming. So I would sit back and I would look at this and I'm just like, man, this looks like a bunch of garbage to me. I can't figure out what anything is.
Right.
But as time went on, and this stuff began to separate, and you began to know these guys, some of who these guys were, that was when I learned how to appreciate it.
Right.
And then I realized at a certain point, the special effects that are in comics is the same thing that they're doing with the graffiti.
Right.
So then I started to have another appreciation for it. And then I realized at one point I was doing graffiti in my own book.
Yeah.
For the same reason.
I was,
So I couldn't really understand how did I go from hating it so much to having a respect for it. And I think it was because it wasn't so overwhelming. And that's how people are introduced to rap music or stuff like that. That's why people say, oh, I hate rap music. I said, no, you don't hate rap music. It's just you can't separate it. You can't pick out what you want
How to parse it,
to
yeah.
listen to or whatever. There's all different kinds of rap.
no doubt.
And they couldn't figure that out. Then the other part of it was I wasn't a hip hop guy. I was walking around Harlem, the hardest parts of Harlem, with a tweed jacket with patches on it. I just, the clothing thing, I just never really got into that part of it. But then I realized, you know, I would watch the break dances on the street, and I started to appreciate that. So I began to start liking the music a little bit at a time, and eventually I like more of the music, and now I'm pretty much only listening to rap music.
That's a beautiful thing.
And people like Rob Stoll here helped me appreciate the graffiti part of it even more than I had before, because I couldn't put a face to most of the stuff. It was just stuff. It was these names that I couldn't figure out. It was just, like I said, and sometimes people were doing graffiti on top of other people's graffiti, which to me is very disrespectful for people to do that.
Yeah.
And
Sometimes.
I couldn't separate it. So it's like once it started to kind of go apart, and I began to know these guys individually, and I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool.
Not to go against you, big bro, but I loved all of that too. And you're not that much older than me. But when I would get on those old subway trains and just, it was everywhere and was just almost like
You couldn't
like
read the
wallpaper.
map. You couldn't read the map to go anywhere.
I loved that though. I loved every aspect of that though. I was just like,
And it was always in these dirty trains. And
yep.
people,
I miss all of that
people
though.
going to the bathroom trains and
Yep.
stuff like that. It was just so overwhelming. It was just hard to kind of step away from it and be able to actually look at it for
Right.
what it was.
Right.
Like I said, it took a long time. All the other stuff I eventually learned how to appreciate. I still don't wear the hip hop clothes. I mean, I'm 60 years old. So
What does that mean?
I don't wear that anyway. So I never got into
You're good, you're good,
I have a
homie.
question in all of this. I do.
But all that other stuff, like I said, I learned how to appreciate it over a period of time.
I would love
It's
to.
another form of art.
I would love to know what you guys, just quickly, so we can also take some more audience questions. What are your quick thoughts on like the perceived accessibility of graph and hip hop, and honestly, your art
Perceived, I like that.
in Black comics? Yes,
The perceived
perceived. Okay,
accessibility.
yes, because we know that the actual accessibility is very different, but the perceived accessibility of yes.
Well,
Go ahead.
It's very
I
encouraging
hope I
from this
understand.
story.
No,
Yeah.
well, I hope I understand the question correctly. But I'm just gonna go for it.
Yeah.
No, because
to their
because,
answers.
Because I think what I really love about this exchange, and I don't know y'all's ages or whatever, but we talked about and a little bit earlier about like the intergenerational conversations that are having, right? So even if maybe you're just a few years younger, you know, maybe his entry into graffiti was different, right?
Oh, it definitely was.
And so I think that has a lot to say about a lot of things in general. So when you talk about the accessibility, I think access points are really important. I think especially in hip hop now, when hip hop is old enough to have multi-generations coming through it, right? Because when it was born, right, I don't know y'all's ages again, but I feel like we might be of the same era. And we grew up alongside with it. It didn't come along
Right.
and introduce itself, right?
It was like a choice that we made, a
was a
conscious
choice
choice
we
we
made.
made as young people.
As young people to be involved in it. It didn't
Right.
it didn't self-invite itself, right? And so I think even with the music now, and I want to like kind of talk about my experience with hip hop using music. I feel like the same way you were saying about the graffiti is how I felt about the newer music, because I'm more of like a 90s hip hop head, right? And I was like, I don't understand this new stuff, and I don't like it, right? It's true. And it took a while. Like there was so much noise, right? And I was like, I'm not gonna listen to this. I'm just gonna stick to my old school stuff. And then one day, you know, I'm on YouTube, and you know how it like auto plays, and this album came on, and it was a newer artist, and I had like there was enough silence. It was like separated, to use your words. And it sunk to me, and I was like, oh wow, I really love this. It was Kendrick Lamar's first album, but that's what I'm telling you. For a long time, I didn't listen to nothing else but the old school stuff.
Yep.
And then that album, it was about a good 10 years before I listened to anything else. And that album kind of opened the doors for me to be like, oh, I get it now, at least a little bit, and I accept for what it is, and it sent me on a path searching to find more of the newer stuff that I appreciate.
But see, this is what I realized with that kind of, exactly what you're talking about, listening to the old stuff. But every era that there is of music, there's probably that 25 to 50 songs that are your favorite songs of that time period. So you just repeatedly keep listening to that. You're talking about, oh man, the music from the 70s, the best music it was. But you're only talking about those songs.
Right.
Most of the rest of the stuff is
That's
garbage. So for every era of music that there is, what people are usually first introduced to is the garbage. It just sounds like a bunch of noise to you until eventually it's separated down to that handful of people who have great albums, or great singles, or whatever. And so what you said, you have to sometimes kind of explore
Yeah, big time.
of whatever time, because I mean, I'm quick to say, oh, music of today is terrible. But why is it terrible? It's terrible because I don't think I've heard the best stuff yet.
Yeah.
I'm still listening to the top 20 or top 30 songs, which usually those kind of songs you're not that much into anyway.
No one is.
And then it's just the change from what you're familiar
The
with.
change part.
It's hard to make that change. Like I have a friend, he won't listen to anything that came past 1978. Music doesn't even make sense to him past that point. I mean, he still has VHS tapes.
Yeah.
And all that kind of stuff because he's fixated of a certain time period.
Yeah, some people can get caught
And
there.
I think I'm pretty good at kind of exploring, listening to new stuff. You know, most of it I can't get into. But
Yeah.
every once in a while, there's something I'm like, oh, that's pretty good.
You know what it directly relates to. You guys made some really great points that I wanted to just go back on, and it's just so the music, the art. You were saying how you was doing graffiti in your books. It's all an energy, right? It's that energy that kind of. So I love like the graffiti train when I was a kid. I was like, damn, this. I was always a fan of that energy as a
You
young
talking about
kid.
the New York one?
Yes.
Harlem,
We used to go to Brooklyn every summer. That's where we stayed. And just being exposed to the graffiti like that, like, I don't know, it just captivated us. That's what really made that inspired me to really like put that type of stuff in the books because we never seen that. You know, like I don't know. I hear you when you say it is overwhelming, but for some reason that shit was inspiring to me. Like I liked it. I don't know. It just gave me character. It's dangerous, but I like the character of it was. I don't know. It was dope to me.
I'm glad you jumped in. When you heard the first question, I'm glad that you found an access point for yourself. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. I try to bring it all full circle.
I see 3 already questions in the crowd. We got 1, 2, 3. Start with you.
Okay. There's something wrong with this panel.
I know what it is.
What? I knew what she's gonna say. Let's hear
What
it
is
out.
wrong with it? Yeah, okay.
You can share it yourself, ma'am. You're a strong black woman.
Okay. Where are the sisters, Mr. Pro?
There you go.
Mr. Pro Black?
You got the wrong
You're
Rob.
confusing me with somebody.
You get the wrong Rob.
Different Rob.
All right, well.
Is that a good Rob? All good Robs.
Well, there's one right here.
Can we
There is one
have,
right here, yeah.
can we have like a mentoring and?
I can shout out some sisters right now. Afua Richardson,
We needed to have had them here.
Ashley Wood.
Aletha Martinez,
Ask, but they've already, like,
Ashley Woods.
It's also about like schedules.
And those are,
Correct, yeah.
and I think the folks on this panel
Ari
are,
Monroe.
yeah.
She's raising a good point. Even
You think-
graffiti with female, right? There's not that many.
So that's the question. So you asked, the second part of your question was about mentorship, right? And I think that is how often the table expands like to other audiences. When we diversify the voices in a genre, then people get more representation. And as a high school teacher of 20 years, I can tell you that they're coming. You know, I brought like the two people who are illustrating, you know, with me on the wall downstairs are two young women, the first to step up of like hundreds of young people I taught. So I think that those voices are coming, but often those voices are different, right? And I think sometimes when you, and let's be honest, the hip hop, the graph world was heavily male dominated and not exclusive, right? And the comics world is also heavily male dominated and definitely not exclusive. Though it's growing and diversifying now, but in Boston, like that, we're all kind of Boston. And to find those graffiti art, like people who are we're kind of with four unicorns up here. To find a unicorn, you know, with the X chromosome.
She's somewhere.
Can I speak?
Roxbury, Dorchester, Cambridge.
Give
them my
mind,
number.
let me, if I could add on, and especially coming from like the animation space, there's far less feminine presence, right? Female presence, but there are organizations putting efforts to right the ship, so to speak, right? So Mark and I, we did a mentorship from a program called Women in Animation, and their directive is to have 50-50 representation of women in the industry by 2025. So they have like a solid mission that we partake in, and we took in we took 13 young women. We had a selection process, right? And there were at least, we had to pick 13, and there were out of 60. So that's to say, like, and we were just one group of mentors. They're in our mentor circle, they call it. There were like 10 mentors, right? So each mentor had at least 60 people, 60 women going in and trying to apply for this mentorship. So they are there. I think the programming is catching up. They're not at this panel right now, which I know is the point, but they are there.
I would say of the 60 applicants that signed up for our program, there was only like 4 like black women there. We grabbed every single one of them. It's like, yes.
So we picked them
regardless of what their criteria or their skill level, right? Because there is a lack, even in animation, like there is such a lack of women, black women particularly, but women altogether, of like women animators. You don't know where they are, and the industry is looking for them. Like they're looking everywhere.
There's a disconnect somewhere.
There's a drought.
And I think there's a difference between an industry, right? That's because honestly, comics, animation, those are respectable, right? For lack of a better term, no matter if they're geek or fringe, right? They're respectable jobs and careers. Comics, respectable jobs and careers. Graph is different, right? It's self-selected. And I think, as I said, they're still out there, but they're harder to find. To ask this question, when I'm out painting in the parks, a good friend of mine who's an advocate in the arts in Boston rolled up to me, "Where are the women on this wall?" I'm like, "Yo, you paint? Get on the wall. Like, if you find them, bring them." And I think I can't make them. I can't make anybody, go out and buy paint and jump fences and paint walls. But I think that for this specific panel, this specific set of questions is trickier to have that type of representation unless you are really intentional about adding someone to the panel to invite that tension. But
I also
You're the
want
moderator.
to ask this, just like a quick follow-up to this audience question, is because you guys have worked in both in the Boston area and outside of the Boston area, do you find that there is something specific about this area and how it interacts with artists, illustrators, and creatives of color versus sometimes when you're working in other places?
Yeah.
Which is feedback we have heard over the course of
I wanted
Comics and
to-
Color existing.
I want to get that. I want to hit that point. But
I
want to.
but I also want these other two audience questions.
I just
but
wanted to
also
pick.
want this question.
I just wanted to piggyback on what we were just talking about. I think the author's name is Akebe, where he has a famous quotable that says, "If you don't like somebody's story, you write your own." So that's, I think, what I was addressing when we first started the discussion. To gain access to specific platforms, and sometimes the necessary move is to gain the information and the insight and create your own platform so that then you can be in a position to offer that opportunity to others. And we're all up here doing that in some form or fashion or to a degree. So because we've seen it how it was originally presented to humans. And if there was something that was missing, then we said, okay, once I obtain that information and that knowledge and position myself in a place where I can give back, then that's where that happens, and then it becomes a more fluid and organic process. But I've lived here in Boston, born and raised, and I've also lived in New York. And I think the Boston is always home. But I think from an opportunity standpoint, because I had a studio when I was out there. You know, shout out to my former studio mates, Karan Grant, Chris Walker, and this is 20 years ago. And what we were doing specifically with the studio was infusing the aspects of the worlds that we were living in, which was music, i.e. hip-hop, graffiti, and comic books. Me and Karan Grant were the regular artists on Iron Man at the time. And this predates all of the hype from the Iron Man movies. But our main purpose for forming the studio was to have an answer to that void in culture that we all identified, and that's why we do the work that we do now, where that intrinsic connection between visual art and i.e. comics, hip-hop, graffiti, and music, specifically hip-hop music, because I believe there's a distinct difference between rap music and hip-hop music, that we saw an absence of or a void. And we worked on some amazing projects. We worked with Cornerstone Promotions when they were just an industry mag. They had mixtape series. We did the mixtape for DJ Green Lantern. I mean, that's a no-brainer. You know, 3 comic book dudes. I mean, we worked with Guru from Gangstar. We worked with Violator. We worked with, I mean, in a whole host of different record labels. So I think being there in that environment with everything that city represents, it either makes you or it breaks you. And to just fall out of bed and just say, I can pound the pavement one whole afternoon and come back with some kind of lead. And I think that's the difference. You can do it from here because everything is so global now, and we're more connected now than ever before. But back then, it was not what it is present day. So.
Can I add on to that? Or we had a really hard time, like, making our authentic voice heard and stick in Cambridge. And this is early on too, so we're green, we don't really know business like that. But reflecting now, when we moved to Atlanta, the business was just like boom, because there was a system, there was a culture that supported what we were doing, the type of art we were doing, right? So we just plugged in. And then once we figured out, like, you know, this is when hip hop was having a real moment in the 90s, and so we're doing a lot of like promotional stuff for hip hop. And then when we moved to LA, like, we were able to take our voice because we had refined it, doing, you know, a lot of the promotional stuff and a lot of underground stuff. And then we moved to LA, we were able to refine it, but LA already has an industry that can support it, right?
Definitely.
And so I think one of the hardest struggles here in the early days was there wasn't as much of an industry to support it, but with the internet, you could be anywhere. You know, you could be anywhere. Satellite work. You could have a digital studio, and put out work. So I would
definitely say take advantage of being able to access literally any place on the planet.
All right, I'm gonna go through these last two audience questions. We are definitely going till 3 also.
It wasn't so much as a question as it was like resonating with the earlier subject of I think when speaking on like visibility is something that I noticed that I found being spoken in this conversation was all the things that I was interested in as a young kid. I felt like it wasn't around, but it was because we were all holding it all in. And then now that we all put it out, it seems like it happened every day. I was like, oh, this is cool now. Like, I was like, I was doing this cool. It was like we all were. And that's what it is so cool is when we actually fall into it. And now the systems and the culture is being created because we feel visible. And I think that's something to like recall when we find something to critique about the system. Like, you don't look at a blueprint because it's not a house. It's not. It's meant to become the eventual manifestation of it.
That's a dope point, bro.
That's a dope point.
It is, I mean, it is something when like, because it's kind of like with anime now, right? Like anime, I see a lot of younger people here, but I remember when anime was like, nobody was into it. It was kind of like the comics when we were growing up. You kind of had to.
It was just underground.
It was underground.
It was underground.
Like, super underground though. But now, when anime is like this global phenomenon, and I just remember like, damn, I was doing anime before everybody. Now they selling it in the stores, you know, you're like, oh. But no, it's that thing. It's like you keep it precious, but when the whole world like finally like grabs onto it, you're like, I don't know. It's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see, but it's kind of bittersweet too. You know?
Yep.
My question is, like, I grew up in the South End, so I grew up in Boston. For me, it was open. Like, I hopped on the elevated train, went right downtown to the comic store, like, every week. You know, so it was like, for us, it was open. And it was the same thing with hip-hop, same thing with graffiti and stuff like that. My question to y'all is, when did it become you? Like, hip-hop was around us, geekdom was around us, comic books was around us. When did you put yourself and your own identity into the artwork, into the, you know, what
Day one.
7th grade in the hallway of Boston Latin Academy at 174 Ipswich Street. In between classes, I was showing a drawing of Wolverine to my friends and Mark Seitz, German-American man. Homeboy looked at me and said, B, you ever realize that all the characters you draw are white? And then the bell rang and he walked off and I was astounded.
Bell literally rang a minute ago.
And I was like, that was the moment. And like it was like almost a 180 degree turn, and it shook me to my core, like, oh, because at the same time I was listening to KRS-One and Public Enemy and everything, and my identity, I was starting to, you know, challenge what I learned in church. Like, I was like, oh wow, wait a minute, was Moses black? I was thinking about like my consciousness, my black consciousness was emerging, but here I am reproducing stuff, right? And like my nephew's here, he could tell you like all the stuff around those times, like it was black comics and black characters. And my first job in independent comics, I was trying to push like a Rastafarian character, and it was that was it. And it was my friend, a white colleague, was like, yo, where you at?
You want to get more questions? I mean, day one, that would be my answer. Day one is when I saw myself in it. I mean, just because there was such an absence and a void of us. So, because I was just so fascinated and captivated by the culture of comic books, but then also just being a byproduct of hip hop. Because I have lived experience. You know, I didn't study in books, and no, I lived through all of this. So my stories are authentic, and you know, I mean, I drew comic books in the 3rd grade with my classmates. You know, and because we were so comic book geeks, we knew all of the different responsibilities from a creator standpoint and the collaborative nature of it, a writer, a penciler, an inker, a colorist. We did all of that in the 3rd grade, made our own books and sold them to our classmates at recess. So we had that understanding as far back as 3rd grade. So for me, it was day one.
It's pretty dope, man. That is dope.
All right, it is literally 3. I just need one more super quick, I'm sure, incredibly quick audience question before we let the next people in here. Let's grab it.
So this is my son. I'd love for him to read your work and read other work, and you started talking about some people. I go on Google and I don't seem to find you all. How can folks like us, I'm not a comic person, how can we find your work more easily? What would you say to follow? What should we check out?
Yeah, let's get some social handles, people.
I'm saying you've been downstairs and been collecting cards, and I think that's a great place to start. And the group Comics in Color, what we set up when we're back in person again, we set up a whole table with all the black artists and creators that we can find. So send them to the Comics in Color, and I don't know, maybe somebody will throw together a Comics in Color like website or something like that. If there's a a real nerd. Challenge.
I think also on the website, it does list the names of a lot of people who are participating, and maybe just a little research on that. But the list is pretty extensive, and there's some there are heavyweights in the industry, like these guys, like that MFA shit, bro.
Thank you, brother.
That shit was amazing. It is amazing.
Thank you, man.
We do have a fair amount, including some good partnerships, because there are some very just women-specific comic festivals that are here in the area that are also working at their booths downstairs. But I'm also going to very much encourage everyone to go downstairs and meet some of these amazing artists in person. Thank you, guys.
You can also Google Barrington Edwards, Rob Stoll, Larry Stroman, Blockheads.